Shavuot and Hag Sameach to everyone who's with us virtually or in the room. We're looking forward to a beautiful, beautiful Hag and standing at Sinai once again. I invite you to rise for page 39A in Lev Shalem. Page, I don't know what, 279, I think it's in Shalom.
Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach
Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed.
You may be seated. Baruch Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam asher bidvaro mari v'ravim
Umavir yom umevi layla umavdia ben yom uven layla Adonai tzivot shemo El chai v'kayam tamirim lochaleinu le'olam va'en Baruch atah Adonai Hamariv Haravim. Page 40 of Atolam Yisrael.
כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו בהם נהגי יומם ולילה ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך וימשמור תשמעותיך. Seat.
Adonai Elohechem Emet.
Page 43 AMF. I'm going to put something in. המשתלם גמלוך pray for redemption, page 44. Yanai, nanai, nai, yanai, nai, 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 nai. Ay, nanai, nai, ay, nai, 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 nai. Umachuto beratzon kiblu aleihem. Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael. Cha'anu shira. Besimcha raba ve'amru chulam. Ay, ay, ay. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh nora tehilot oseferet malchutecha ra'u banecha mokei hayam lifnei Moshe zeheli anu ve'amru Adonai imlo le'olam ba'er rai rai hai rai 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 hai rai 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 hai 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 rai 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 ונאמר כי פד אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. Amen. We pray for peace, page 45. Hashkivenu Adonai Le'Hashem. ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ועל Yerushalayim. Please rise, page 46.
וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל.
After Chatzi Kaddish, we'll move to the silent Amidah, turning to face Yerushalayim on page 306.
And include the sections corresponding to Saturday night. יתגדל ויתקדש מרבה, וילמד דברה קילותי והמליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן, יהא שמי רבה מברך, לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה יתברך. וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה ברכו לאלה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. קדשנו במצוותיך ותן חלקנו בתורתך קדשנו במצוותיך ותן חלקנו בתורתך סבנו מטובך ושמח נפשנו בישועתך סבנו מטובך ושמח נפשנו בישועתך.
Kaddish Shalem, page 54. Page 54. יתגדל ויקדש ברבה ויאמרתי ואחריתי וימליך מלכותי וחייכוני ומכון וחי זכו בית יצרה בגלה בזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיה יתברך
וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי קודשה ברכו לאל אמין כל ברכתה ושירתה תוש וכתה ונחמתה דמירם בעלמה ואמרו אמן.
אמן. תתקבל צונו ותונכו ישראל קדמו משמיה ואמרו אמן.
אמן. יש למה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
אמן.
עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו amen.
We turn now to Kiddush for Hag on page 79 with Havdalah.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל עם ורוממנו מכל לשון וקידשנו במצוותיו. ותיתן לנו אדוני אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה חגים וזמנים לששון את יום חג השבועות הזה זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים ומועדי קודשך בשמחה ובששון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא מאורי האש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם המבדיל בין קודש לחול בין אור לחושך בין ישראל לעמים בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה בין קדושת שבת לקדושת יום טוב הבדלת ואת יום השביעי מששת ימי המעשה קידשת הבדלת וקידשת את עמך ישראל בקדושתך. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לקודש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
Not only Shechianu for this moment, but also we haven't been together for Shavuot. This is the third. We missed 2 years of Shavuot together, to have people in the sanctuary. So it's a great gift to be together. Of course, those who are joining us virtually, but to have a sanctuary with people is a beautiful gift because Torah can't be received alone, and we've missed you. So let's turn now to Aleinu, page 56.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא
שנותן שמיים ויסודות ומרשע וקרוב בשמיים ימלא שכין יסוד. אוקיי, נקבל.
על כן נקבל ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
We turn now to Mourner's Kaddish on page 58 for all those in mourning or marking a yard site. And if you're on Zoom, you're welcome to unmute it this time. Yitgadal v'kadash shemei Rabba.
Amen.
Be'ama dirach yiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh. B'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael. Bagala u'v'zman kariv v'yamru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olmei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar, v'yitaleh, v'yitalal, shmei dekudesha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'roma, v'yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'yimru amen.
Amen.
Be seated. Shavuot Tov and Hag Sameach to everyone. It's wonderful again to see so many of you in the sanctuary and for all those who are joining us davening from home. And this is the plan for the evening. We'll in a moment sing some piyutim, some songs before we move into the evening study. And we're really blessed this Motzei Shabbat to have our colleagues and friends with us to have a conversation about the meaning of covenant. So shortly we'll invite all of them here, and then we'll study together until a little bit before midnight. We'll have a break for people to stretch and go to the bathroom, and then we'll make our way up to the roof for the all-night study. You can, we always say this, if it's, not everyone is a late night owl, but stretch a little bit more than you would have at another time. And given that we have a couple years to make up of having this experience, maybe it's the year to stretch a little bit more. So stay a little longer. And then the service, there'll be an early morning service after the all-night study at 5 a.m., which will be on the roof. And then the rest of us will gather at 10 for the tefillah here, followed by a community picnic. And the weather is supposed to be excellent. I don't think we've had low 70s and beautiful in a long time for the community picnic. So we'll be gathering around 90th Street near Hippo Park as a community after the service tomorrow night at 8:15, and then Monday morning at 9:30 with Yizkor and the reading of the Book of Ruth. Any other announcements, Roly? Also, do people have the PU team
you have it
as well? Okay.
It works. Hag Sameach, everyone.
Yeah.
So let's sing a couple of piyutim to get in the mood of Shavuot and the mood for learning and opening our heart and appreciating the beauty of this night, this mythic night. It's our sacred myth, our memory that we are all at Sinai together with all our other brothers and sisters. And we're joining for this night, to open our heart to hear God's revelation, to experience God's presence, to get God's message. And Midrash says that, as we said this morning, there was fragrance all over. Everybody was surrounded by this beautiful fragrance. And the silence until God erupted, God's voice erupted and reached everybody's heart. So trying somehow to reconnect to that memory in our heart. We all have that memory in our heart or somewhere in our consciousness. So we're trying to go back, and sometimes the piyutim really bring us there. So this piyut, Nirdi Natan Recho, it's in the handout, and we've been singing it for many years, so many people here know it, and we'll sing it now. Nirdi, 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 Nirdi Natan Recho, Melech B'Sibo, Yom Adonai, Navi Nismach Bo, Ele Natan Le'amo, Torah Temima, Yafa Levana, Baraka Chama, Notenet Liftaim, Dat Zima, Yarda, 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 Mishechakim, Misheverova, Le'am Asher Ahav, Bechol Levavo, Nirdi, 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 Nirdi Natan Recho, Melech B'Sibo, Yom Adonai, Nagir Nismach Bo, Bachar beYaakov, Lenachalalo, Israel Izgulato, Chelo vechevlo, Be'adchel Elyon, Goyim hema goralo, Tachtit, 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 Tachtit har kulo, Tukuk leraglo, Malachei Elohim, Olim yordim bo, Nirdi, 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 Nirdi Natan Recho, Melech B'Sibo, Yom Adonai, Nagir Nismach Bo, Miso'av Asar, Miflatach Isha, והוציא מתוך כור אבן הראשה, סמוך הנופלה אל הקדושה. נשמת, 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 נשמת חי תברך, נערץ בלי קדושה, ורוח כל בשר, נשמת חיים בו. נרדי, 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 נרדי נתן לכו, מלך ב'Sibo, יום אדוני, נגיד נשמח בו. One more. Yom Yom Odeh. Next page. Nirdi is a Moroccan piyut. Yom Yom Odeh is an Iraqi piyut. Yom Yom Odeh La'el Asher Bahar Banu גאולה, לא לקחנו על הר סיני את תורתו הנחילנו, עשרת דיברות קודשו השמיענו, צבא מרום ריבותיים ירדו עמו, בעת אשר נגלה לישראל עמו, מסיני בא וזרח משעיר למו, בקול שופר חזק מאוד יעננו, חרד ורגז הר סיני אל ביאתו, להנחיל דת לישראל סגולתו, על יד משה עבד נאמן ביתו, ושם עין בעין ראתה עינינו, קדוש כאז תעלה מלכותך עלי, למקדשי שובה ושכון תוכה עולי, וליהתה שלום כמנהר אולי, ועינינו יראו וישמח ליבנו. Now let's go and
So we want to invite
learn.
our colleagues and friends to come join us up here. I mean, there are many colleagues and friends in the Kahal, but those we've asked to join us up here.
So we have Rabbi Marc Margolius, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen, Rabbi Rachel Bovitz, Rabbi Shuli Passow, Rabbi Becca Weintraub, Rabbi Ebersman, Rabbi Felicia, and me.
We just want to also say for those who don't know, all these wonderful people, well, you know Becca Weintraub, Rabbi Rachel Bovitz is the, what is it called, the CEO or the president? Executive Director of the Matalon Center for Education, Jewish Education, and, you know, Shuli Passow, who's our Director of Community Engagement. Rabbi Marc Margolius is the Senior Program Director of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. Rabbi Cohen is the newly appointed Dean of the Rabbinical School at Jewish Theological Seminary. And Rabbi Ebersman, what's the official director?
So many titles. I'm the Director of Jewish Life and the Director of Chesed and Tzedek.
Director of Jewish Life and Director of Chesed and Tzedek at the Abraham Joshua Heschel School. So we're really blessed with these wonderful colleagues and friends.
So we're going to learn, as we have been announcing, the theme tonight is Brit, is covenant. Of course, it's the central theme of Matan Torah, is the moment of this new covenant between God and the Jewish people, the covenant that has been with us and that we have lived in more or less, on our part, on God's part also, maybe more or less, for the last something like 3,500 years, with some ups and downs, big ups and big downs. But here we are, 3,500 years later, and still connected to Torah, and still connected to God, and still connected to each other as community. And since we are now working on the formulation of a community covenant for our community, we thought it would be a good idea to examine some of the foundations of the notion of covenant in our tradition on this night of Matan Torah, and see if we can inform the building of our community covenant with some of these basic ideas and the building blocks of the notion of covenant in our tradition. So we have a number of texts that have been selected, and we'll just jump in with...
I just want to say one other thing, I think, which is more about a macro place about where we are in the world, where there's a lack of social contract in general. In our country, there's a sense that actually we're not covenanted collectively. It's very hard to imagine what that looks like in our time. So much has been broken. There was so much polarization. So in many ways, covenanting is countercultural to where the moment we're living in. And so I think that's another reason why we felt it was important to really think about what it means also, particularly in a liberal context, with the notions of covenant may not be understood in the same way that they are in a more traditional context. And so all the more so at this time when so much is broken, when it feels like a covenanting as a concept is actually broken, all the more so important to return really to this baseline question about what does it mean to stand wanting covenant, serving in the context of community, and how we're bound together. So I think that's another layer of the times we're living in. Sure, so we'll start with the Rabbi Soloveitchik text, which comes from is a selection from it's actually an essay called Fate and Destiny. We've studied at points on the sections called the Covenant of Fate and a Covenant of Destiny. In many ways, also Rabbi David Hartman, Alav Shalom, also wrote a follow-up article which was called Auschwitz or Sinai, thinking about what it meant to be bound together as a people by fate, which is a more defensive position, or by destiny, which is a more aspirational position. And this section that we're going to be reading is really, and studying and discussing, is about the two notions of who we are in that conversation as a community, whether we're a machaneh or a camp, or an eidah, a congregation. So why don't we'll start reading together and then discuss. Anyone?
We're asking someone to read in English?
Yeah,
I can handle that.
In order to explain the difference between the people of fate and the nation of destiny, it's worth taking note of another antithesis, namely the antithesis between camp, machaneh, and congregation, edah. I just want to say it's so unfortunate that the one that we don't want to be is machaneh or camp, since I think of it in such a positive way, but okay. The Torah has used both terms together in speaking of the Israelites. Make thee two trumpets of silver, to beaten work you shall make them, and they shall be unto thee for the calling of the congregation and for causing the camp to set forward. Do you want to read the whole thing?
So in this pasuk, we have the use of both these terms, camp and congregation. And so now he's going to distinguish between these two different terms as applied to the community of Israel gathered in the Midbar, in the wilderness.
Camp and congregation constitute two distinct sociological phenomena, two separate groups lacking any common features, devoid of any symbiotic relationship. The camp is created as the result of the desire for self-defense and is nurtured by a sense of fear. The congregation is created as a result of the longing for the realization of an exalted ethical idea and is nurtured by the sentiment of love. Fate reigns in unbounded fashion in the camp. Destiny reigns in the congregation. The camp constitutes a particular stage in the historical development of the people, while the existence of the nation is identical with that of the congregation. Keep going.
So I think what he puts forth is in many ways, as I opened with, the sense of a defensive orientation versus a fear-driven orientation versus a kind of more aspirational. And I wonder how, if we always divide things that way, like if as a community we think about splitting those two ideas as we're either this or that, and how that feels in reading this, and also how we move between the two, I guess. Is it they're synthesized and we hold them both, or are we actually kind of either or in many times? I'm curious what folks think about that.
I can jump in. As we were learning it and studying it, I was thinking a lot about how we actually have that dichotomy in our relationship with the divine, that we have the yirah and the ahava. And yirah, there, you can play around with that language. Yirah can often be awe-inspiring, but it can also mean fear, and that fear can be a really deep part of the faith that we have, and that it doesn't feel to me like it's such a this or a that, but that it's often a balance between these two, that recognizing, I actually think this is a beautiful text. I'm excited to see where we go with it, but in the moment as I was hearing Anne, you reading it, I was thinking about this yirah and ahava, and that sometimes you need the camp and the edah, that you need the machaneh and the edah in order to be in a deep and meaningful relationship. That if sometimes you're only in a loving relationship, you may not get to where it is that you need to be going. You may not be pushed in the way that you need to, and the same with fear. If you're only in a camp of fear, then you can be paralyzed by that fear and not be able to move forward and not be in relationship in the ways that you want to. So I hold that, and our tradition deeply speaks about that being a necessary part of who we are as individuals and who we are as a collective.
When I read it through the first time, I'm just noticing that I had this immediate preference for the Edah over the Machaneh. That, that's where the breed is. But I was sitting there, I was listening to you read it, and I was thinking about the roots of this country and also about biblical Israel, and how much of both were formed as a Machaneh in self-defense, for a purpose of meeting a common enemy. The tribes organized as a commonwealth, just as the states here organized, created a breed out of a sense of fear, out of a sense of defense, out of a sense of a common enemy in some way. And yet we're also animated by a common vision about what they could be. It's just interesting to me. I don't know what to make of that. It's just that both have been there from the outset in political terms, that this country came together out of a sense of defending itself or protecting itself or opposing an enemy, but also animated by this, the ideals of the founders and the Declaration of Independence. That was there too. But you wonder whether either of them would be sufficient in and of itself to create a breed, that you need both. And so this, like what you were saying, Becca, really is compelling to me, actually, about that. I don't know what to make of that, because I know I kind of shy away from fear as a motivating force, but the sense of connection that is born out of fear of disconnection is an important part of the motivation for breed.
I was thinking, I think it's
Here.
I was thinking along those lines about expansion and contraction of community and of the camps, and when do we feel the need to be in a wider community? Now it's working. Yeah, I couldn't figure it out. Okay, thanks. Kind of when do we feel stronger if we have larger numbers? And is that motivated by fear? Is that motivated by a desire to feel more protected? And when do we experience a contraction? And I think often expansiveness is weighted as positive, is given a positive judgment, and contraction is given a negative judgment. But if we think about the love of Edah as also a connotation of intimacy. There are times when we want a smaller community around us, and maybe that's about also wanting to be self-protective. Maybe it's about wanting to know the people around us in a deeper and more profound way. And it's about more of a multivalent connection. In some ways, the wider machaneh, the protective machaneh, is about, okay, maybe we don't have so much in common, but if we can organize around certain principles, then we can keep the other out, or we can protect ourselves in the necessary ways. And that's good for certain things, and it can be, politically powerful or expedient, but it doesn't have that same level of intimacy. And sometimes, and I was thinking about this as you were reading also in terms of the last 2 years, how much many of our communities contracted, and we really had to think about who were the few people that we felt that we couldn't be without, that we needed to bring into our most intimate bubble, that would sustain us in a really deep way, which interestingly was also driven by fear. So I think the dichotomy of love and fear isn't as simple, but I think it's very, very rich to try to explore.
It's interesting because Soloveitchik is clearly trying to inspire us here towards Edah and towards love, and I feel like we're all getting very interested in the question of fear. And I was thinking when Becca was talking about the guy that did that free climb, did you all see that movie about the guy that does the free climb of a big, really scary mountain? And my cousin, who's a physician, was explaining to me that they've scanned his brain, like he has there's a part of his amygdala that's missing. Like he just doesn't have fear. It just doesn't exist in his brain physically. So on the one hand, he's able to do these amazing things. On the other hand, he's able to do some profoundly stupid things. Like it was profoundly stupid in some way for him to go up there with no rope. Like he had a girlfriend. He may even have had children, I don't remember. And yet he makes this choice because he has no fear. So in what ways is fear useful, and in what ways is fear an impediment? And I just know that for my part, I'm afraid of a lot of things that I think it would be better for me to not be afraid of. I'm afraid to speak my truth frequently. I'm afraid of facing certain things. So I appreciate the call there to Edah, to like a sense of destiny rather than clinging to fear. But then the question is, what kind of fear is actually useful? I find yirah as fear very difficult. I mean, I know that's what it means, but I find fearing God to be a very difficult concept to bring into relationship, to come into relationship with. I don't know.
I'm not reading the sense of, the English here is fear, which we use sometimes to translate the word yirah, but I'm reading Soloveitchik's articulation not so much as prescriptive, but as descriptive. Like, there is fear that is imposed upon us, that it's not that we have a choice, it's that someone else decides that we need to be set up as a camp, that there's some outside threat that stimulates a fear in us, and so we organize as a camp. And think about what are historically called the defense organizations in this country, right? The Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, they're called the defense organizations because they were set up from a posture of there's something outside of us that is saying we need to be fearful and we have to defend against us. We have to defend against that and organize ourselves into a camp. So I do think that here he's not kind of entertaining the idea of fear as a potentially positive force, but just more as this is the reality that sometimes exists for all humans, for all animals, for us. And his kind of emphasis on the Edah, of pushing forward to the Edah, is saying, let's not live in that fear all the time, even when we're put there. I think it's amazing that the pasuk that he cites here refers to the people at the same time as both the Edah and the Machaneh, right? There's a reality sometimes where you're entirely in that camp, Machaneh, fearful mentality. There are times where you're in this limbo, which is Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, at this moment when they've already left Egypt, they've experienced revelation, they've built the Mishkan, they've done something together, and so they're a congregation, but they're still in that place of fear. Something outside of them is not allowing them to fully flourish. And sometimes, hopefully, we get to be in a place of full edut, or edah-ness, of being fully in congregation. And so I think, to me, this speaks to something I have thought about a lot as someone who's, my grandparents or my mother's parents were Holocaust survivors, that their mentality was actually not one of fear coming out of the Holocaust, that they said was not, that even though that's what they experienced, they said that's not why we're going to continue our participation in Jewish life. We're not going to live as if we're still in that machaneh. We are going to live in the Edah and find the beauty and find the meaning and the purpose, which I think is, I don't know that I would do that if I had been through what they had been through, but I think that's quite an extraordinary gift that they gave me to be able to see that there's a reality of fear sometimes, and one can overcome it.
Maybe we skip to the last paragraph, because a lot of what we...
last paragraph?
Yeah, I think that we can safely jump to the last paragraph, because I think that some of the ideas are repeated in some of the things we just said are in these two intermediate paragraphs.
However, the congregation constitutes a distinctive human phenomenon. It is an expression of humanity's powerful spirit. The congregation is a typically human creation, a creation imbued with the splendor of the human personality. The congregation is created not as a result of negative factors, as a result of the fear of fate that pursues the person who senses her misery and weakness, but as the result of positive drives. The foundation of the congregation is destiny. A congregation is a group of individuals possessing a common past, a common future, common goals and desires, a common aspiration for a world which is wholly good and beautiful, and a common, unique, and unified destiny. The beginning of the congregation is grounded in the traditions of the patriarchs, in the people's heritage, reaching back to its obscure dawn, while its end is rooted in a shared eschatological vision. The Hebrew word for congregation, edah, is related to the Hebrew word for witness, ed. The members of the congregation are witnesses, and to what do they bear witness, if not to the events that are long since past, and to a wondrous future that has not yet arrived. The congregation encompasses not only the individuals living in the here and now, but all who have lived and all who will live, from time immemorial until the eschaton. The dead, who have long since passed away, continue to abide in the realm of the congregation, and those who are yet to be born are already living in its domain. The congregation is a holy nation that has no fear of fate and is not compelled to live against its will. It believes in its own destiny, and it dedicates itself out of its own free will to the realization of that destiny. The covenant in Egypt was made with a people born from a camp. The covenant at Sinai was made with a holy nation.
Such beautiful language.
It's a power. I think it's, as I think your point, Shuli, is really well taken. We don't actually get a choice, in some ways about the defensive posture, which he says is the posture of Egypt, right? Which is that we were in that position, and therefore the covenant was made in that moment. We couldn't be anything else. And in fact, it took us a long time to even post-Sinai to get, in some way, extract from the covenant of Egypt. And at the same time, it feels like, and this is where I think the choice plays a part, and I think also why Hartman's follow-up piece around Auschwitz or Sinai, which is a follow-up, is that sometimes I think there are moments in history that beg the question to ask, are we living too much in an orientation that is not enough Sinai, that is not enough toward an edah, because we've been traumatized in many ways by living in a defensive posture. And I think in our times too, with even what's happened in our midst, whether it's Colleyville or Pittsburgh, or that it awakens a historic notion that we were born out of in many ways, of a covenant of fate, and how do we hold that orientation without, I mean, the language here is so powerful about the destiny, and that we lose, in a sense, the ability to even speak the kinds of word of destiny in the midst of being triggered by the covenant of fate. And I think that's in many ways the risk of the historic circumstances and even some of the present day circumstances of being in that defensive posture, is that we lose the breath to actually stand at Sinai again. And it's hard, and also speaks to Ayelet's point about it's hard actually to get grounded in a shared vision of what that looks like. We know what it means to be defensive as a community. We don't always know what it means, and I think in our time, even the questions of what Jewish life is going to be like in the future, there's a lack of shared vision of that in many ways. Who belongs, how much of certain things, and so I think which makes it all the more challenging because the landscape is so unclear.
Just to follow up, I think it's we all experience how fear brings us together. I mean, every time there is a threat or some catastrophe, some sort of external stress on the community, we all come together, we feel wonderful being together, we feel like one, our hearts vibrate to the oneness. But it also deforms us, because it takes away from us the capacity to envision, to dream, to aspire. We're like hunkered down. And I think it's a sad reality. As you said, it's much easier to come together. It's much more often that we feel we come together in a defensive posture than we come together to dream and to envision. And maybe it's because we don't share the same visions as a nation. But Sinai is a powerful propeller into the future. I mean, the gathering at Sinai that we are commemorating and celebrating tonight is like a whole openness. I mean, it's a full open to the entire people. We're going to hear a little later some of the texts that are coming later that it was like just a push into the vision of the future and what could be. But we have difficulty holding on to that. We're much easier like in the lamenting. I mean, one incredible fact of Jewish life, you know what I'm going to say.
I know what you're going to say.
So say it.
We get tons more people here for Tisha B'Av than we would ever get for Yom Ha'atzmaut.
It's a fact. I don't know, people say, no, it's because of camp, because, you know, here people experience Tisha B'Av in camp, and people have those memories, and so they come in the summer to be together. But
we do destruction much better.
We do destruction much better.
But there's something in that is almost essential to Jewish identity. What you're saying, Felicia, is reminding me of, a peak moment in the conversion process for people who choose to join the Jewish people, which is, traditionally you spend a year or more learning, studying, being in the practice, experiencing Sinai, experiencing the Eidah, and then you get to the mikvah and you're told, okay, are you ready to throw your lot in with these people who have been persecuted for thousands of years, right? You have to accept that as the piece of what it means to be part of this people, which in some ways is, I never kind of thought about that before, as you're saying you have to have a piece of this defensive posture. And that's from the Gemara. That's not kind of a new way. It's not post-Holocaust part of the conversion process, but that's like always been part of the identity. But I think maybe you have to do that year of study of Sinai, of Eidah first, before you're reminded of the Machaneh.
I would do it the other way around.
Yeah.
I mean, I would do the, first to say, you want to join the Jewish people, just know, and by the way, that's it, just know that you may run into problems by joining these people. And you will be with us, and if we have to suffer, you'll suffer with us. And now that you've said yes, now look at the glorious opportunity that it opens in your life and in our lives by you joining us. we're bound together by this incredible vision of what the world can be, our connection to God, our connection to purpose, to meaning. Why don't we do it that way? You know what I'm saying? Put the first one, the fear first, but then open the glory of the destiny. I mean,
I was just going to say something, Roly, to what you were saying, is that I think we miss a lot by not having these holidays as actual pilgrimages. And I think, like, we really lose out. Like, that was a moment, like, the Jewish people used to, like, all travel together. Like, and I think, I was thinking about what you were saying about Yom Ha'atzmaut, but, like, if you have a mission to Israel, like, suddenly it has a different energy, right? And there's something about that sort of traveling, coming together. I think Shavuot, like, suffers the most out of all of the 3 pilgrimage holidays. For Passover, we have the Seder, and for Sukkot, we gather, you know, in the Sukkah, and we don't have, like, something that has that kind of, other than staying up all night, has that kind of momentum that kind of brings us together in that really, like, positive movement kind of way.
I appreciate what you said, Roly, about how I think you said deformed. Is that what you said?
Yes.
By the fear. I was thinking about it because I was thinking about, well, you know, the moments when we're under threat, thinking about post 9/11 in the city, you know, what it felt like in terms of the whole city coming together, the country coming together. Then you think about what is sacrificed out of those experiences. Like, in some ways, think, what a wonderful moment. Everybody was together, right? And you think about the damages to the ideals of this country, right? And what people have been willing to lose and sacrifice out of that fear. So I actually really want to commend you and say kol hakavod, because using this as an opportunity to bring our attention to the distinction between community that is created or motivated by fear and community that is created and motivated out of shared ideals, you know, as expressed, you know, is really, I'm like sitting here thinking, yes, this is such boy, what an important corrective, because we've been seeped in that sea of fear. We still are, but, you know, we are living in a sea of fear right now, and this really lifts us up out of that, helps us see something much better, more beautiful.
You know, Marc, you know, the one counterexample to everybody coming together in moments of sadness after 9/11, the one counterexample, and I know because there was an anniversary recently, was when was the whole world one? When were we all together? Was when when stepped on the moon, right? And that was a moment of destiny and a moment of, like, forward. That was a moment when we got to I mean, I was 2, I was fast asleep, but presumably it was a rare moment of getting to feel what it's like to be unified around a sense of promise and destiny and the ability to create goodness in the world. So it's a really interesting comparison between how it felt the morning after 9/11 and how it must have felt when people were watching TV that night.
It's interesting to me, thinking about machaneh, a lot of us are using examples of kind of American civic connection rather than Jewish communal connection. And when I think about it also, when I think about when have I felt like I'm part of a huge machaneh, in some ways in an uncomplicated way. I think about being at, you know, huge reproductive justice marches. I think about being at the Pride March. I think about, you know, this past, when we were, voting in November 2020, and that, a lot of us were in that crazy line trying to vote on 102nd Street. It was the first time we'd seen each other in person since before the pandemic. And it was such a moment of kind of jubilant connection with this wider machaneh. And in all of those, there are certainly people who are not in that machaneh, and part of the joy of gathering and being present and stepping up is to assert our place in terms of who our machaneh is. And in those moments, I wouldn't say I felt motivated by fear, but certainly there was a sense of kind of who are our people and who are not our people. Yes. But there also wasn't, again, necessarily that sense of intimacy. We know that there were a couple of, in those contexts, there are a few things that connect us, but we don't know very much about each other in a lot of those places. That connection is enough to show up and make our voices heard. To be in the Edah, in the community, in the congregation, requires I think, a different kind of connection. And I'm trying to think about why my Machaneh examples are secular examples and my Eidah examples are Jewish examples. And that's part of, I guess, the world I inhabit and where my intimacies are. But it's, I don't know, I'm finding it's interesting to think about that.
I was actually taken back to Sinai, that a little bit of a spoiler.
Because you were there about that, apparently.
We were all there.
Or maybe not,
Spoiler
being
alert.
a woman, it's unclear.
Spoiler alert for later at 2 a.m. if you're going to be joining us. But one of the texts that I brought is that our tradition does have an idea that the moment of Sinai, both in the actual text itself, that it was a horrifying moment. That it wasn't necessarily, it may have been this external fear that pushed us into covenant. That there is, the rabbis even teach that potentially God held the mountain over the people as if to say, it's either the Torah or death. This is going to be your grave if you don't choose this. So now going back into our tradition a little bit, even to the moment of the covenant, I wasn't thinking about it again. I think also what feels really exciting about this conversation is just the actualization of what it is to read a text on your own and then to live and study the text with others, that this is what Torah is all about. And when I first read it, none of this was coming to mind. And as we're speaking and as we're in conversation, realizing that there's so much fear that's in the moment of Sinai, and the Eidah itself is actually a machaneh. It goes back to that first text, that the two are one and the same. Even in this very moment of covenant, potentially fear was at the heart of that just as much as that love and that acceptance. Or maybe you would say, and this goes back to your question, Felicia, the two were completely different stories of the same event that happened. Did they both happen, or is it no, there was the fear, or there was the avenue of coming together, which also leads us to the next text, which I think gives a little bit more of that love piece of it in the Midrash that we'll see.
I also think, I was thinking about Anne's point about machaneh, which is camp, that in many ways I think communal, like our communal, at least I can speak to my communal experiences growing up, often were oriented around the machaneh in a more defensive posture, the power moments. Like, and it wasn't until I actually went to camp that I realized that like the visionary part, like I didn't have an attachment. I think Jewish life, at least when I was growing up, you know, the kind of orienting aspect of it was around the defensive position, even if I didn't grow up at a time, you know, I grew up in the 70s, so the Holocaust was not as primal as it was, but it was still pretty primal. And it took camp actually to catalyze a vision that Jewish life was so inspiring. That most, I think it's much easier to touch the notion of traditionally how he calls a machaneh, because it's implicit in the tradition in ways that I think Sinai, at least as he portrays, is much harder to touch unmarred. That vision, one, going back to your point, Marc, is often born out of a defensive posture. Like, as much as we're against something, it means then we're for something. And so, and I think as a Jewish people, right, I mean, that's also why people speak about the Shoah as a catalyzer for the state of Israel, even though it wasn't true, like fully. Like, it's not like it was that uncomplicated. But there's something about that kind of orientation, that if, then, therefore. And I think it's hard to have a really bold vision without also living in that kind of defensive posture, and I think it's hard in Jewish life to touch that. And I think particularly growing up, camp was the first time I felt like I had that, because that Jewish life was only positive in a sense. Like,
except for on Tisha B'Av.
But
they don't have that in the Reform movement. They don't have that at
either. No, I think there's a lot of questions about that, and particularly in our time, with the state of Israel and the complications, that Jewish life is not ever really uncomplicated in that way. And even though Sinai in its origin was filled with fear, tomorrow morning, that's not the orientation we have. Like, it's not the way the tradition tells the story. It's covenant, it's wedding, it's, so we retell the story, I think, in a much less complicated, fear-driven way.
I don't know though, Felicia, yes and no, because, Becca was just quoting like maybe the most famous midrash about Sinai. I mean, the midrash that everybody knows, is this like God holds the mountain over their heads? So the rabbis go out of their way, right, to tell this story of fear, which is so fascinating, which is so different than what we experience tomorrow morning with the chuppah and the love. Like, why did they go out of their way to tell this story about a covenant under duress out of fear? I've always asked myself that question.
I think it's more about coercion, actually. I think it's more about coercion than that. Like, I think that's part of the Sinai piece, which is like, if it's a covenant out of coercion and then they make it a covenant by choice, like that's a really profound shift over the course of time.
I've been reading this amazing article by Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg called The Voluntary Covenant, and he talks exactly about this, that yes, Sinai was a coercive covenant, but that's ultimately not where we landed. We landed, and the rabbis say, we landed at Purim, where the language of the Megillah says that the Jewish people, kimu v'kiblu, they accepted all of this upon themselves, and that was the moment of voluntary covenant, and that's where we've been ever since. That's that's the world that we live in, the world of, he writes about hidden miracles. So I think, I'm sure there are people, I know there are people, Jews today, who think about, yes, this is incumbent upon us. This is God's command. I am forced to do this. It is required of me. But I think for a lot of people, myself included, and many others who are very committed to the notion of halacha and commandedness, and there being mitzvah and a mitzaveh, commandments and a commander, that you're stepping into that covenant voluntarily, and there's great value in that there's something very worthwhile to, maybe it's experienced as sacrifice, or maybe ultimately it's experienced as something we let go of for our individual gain that ultimately serves a much greater purpose, and that's how he writes about it in the article, which I think for me is very, very compelling. We live in a world where all of us we're here voluntarily. Nobody said to anybody here tonight, you must come this evening. But everyone chose to be here. So I would say, think about what's compelling to be here tonight? Why did you step into this choice to live in this way, to celebrate this holiday, to practice at this time? Like, it's Saturday night. You could be out, at a Broadway show. But you're here, and I think that's something, especially outside, even within the Orthodox world, but especially outside of the Orthodox world, that we should really think about. What does that mean to take on covenantal responsibility and covenantal obligation? And where do we grow? What do we gain from that? It's a beautiful thing.
I read the threat of putting the mountain above their head and saying, you either accept the Torah or this is going to be your grave. Slightly differently, I feel God's despair. I need you. I need you. I can't let you go. You can't say no. You can't say no. Because if you say no, my whole enterprise, my whole plan, my whole vision for the world is finished. So I need you to say yes. And if you say no, it's the end. It's the end of my dream for this world. And so I don't see it so much as a threat of annihilation of the people, but as an expression of God's powerful desire to move on with this people on this journey. And as an expression of love, and not so much as a violent or threatening or that type of a thing.
I'm sorry, I've just got to interject a little humor here, which is, as you were saying that, Roly, I was having this idea of, what if it was a rom-com? like, what would God's role be there? And I had this image of John Cusack holding the boombox outside, saying, "This is it. I've got to have you."
It's a very Roly Matalon read of that. It's a very Roly.
Say yes.
I just love, it's a very you read of that story. I think also they weren't capable of saying yes. There's a difference also. I think I spoke about this, I don't know, maybe last year. I think they needed the pressure, which is
true,
different.
But at the same time, the text says, they said Naaseh v'nishma, the two live together. They say, we will do, we will just go into this, Naaseh v'nishma. And then this lives in tension with the story that it was that was forced on them.
Right, so my feeling is that they didn't have the fullness actually to say, they may have mouthed the words, but after the trauma of Egypt, after living in such a defensive posture, this is part of the tension, I think, with this, is when you're always in a machaneh mode, then you don't know how to say yes voluntarily. It coaches you to not say yes. I think that's the concern about living in a machaneh position, and that's, I think, was Hartman's concern too later, is that you get so living in a machaneh mentality that everything is no. It's harder to say yes if you're always afraid or think people are coming to get you. And I think there's a question whether the Israelites had a readiness, which is why I think the Purim piece is so powerful, is that they could and Purim of all holidays, right, that it's the most wild of holidays in a sense. I think that's really a powerful transition, and I think part of the question is what do we gain and what do we lose by these different orientations? What do we miss? And I think your question, Shuli, is really important. Why are we here? Which they answer because our ancestors were, because we live in a defensive posture, it doesn't work for Shavuot.
Can I go back to what Roly said for a minute? And I agree, Felicia, that's such a Roly reading, oh my gosh. I had an experience recently. I was teaching about the 10 Commandments in 4th grade, and I was having a great deal of difficulty with the class that Susan is well acquainted with. And it was very meta in a way, because I was trying to convey why are rules important. I started by asking them, think of a rule that you have at home or at camp or at school that actually feels valuable. And it just chaos emerged. And at a certain point, I actually lost my temper, which I really try not to do in 4th grade. And losing my temper was actually related to the fact the lesson was really important to me, and I felt like there was something really valuable for them there. And actually, when I lost my temper, they kind of organized themselves, which I think is a little bit, lahavdil, but I'd like to think that they sensed that there was actually some kind of a love in losing my temper, this is really important, I need you to listen. And I feel like that's related to the question of covenant emerging out of relationship, right? So Roly is reading this moment with the tub above them as in some way a moment of love, of God saying, I need you for this project. And I've been thinking a lot since we knew we were talking about covenant, about how covenant has to merge from relationship, that you can't just be okay, I'll do all these things, that it has to come out of some sense of relationship to God or to the Jewish people, and what does it mean to cultivate the type of relationships that will enable us to be willing to enter into covenant, to take on obligations?
I think sometimes the accepting of a covenant can deepen the relationship. And if you're waiting for the relationship to get to a certain point before saying yes, think about a marriage, a partnership. You enter into a marriage not knowing what is ultimately going to be asked of you, right? You might know certain things, and you might know what it means to move in with someone and to share a certain aspect of life, but a lot of things are going to be asked of you that you didn't know. Well, at least that's my experience of marriage. Maybe everyone else has a different experience. But I think when you open to, oh, I said yes to this enterprise, and so how do I navigate the tension between what I want, what feels necessary for me, what feels like I need this to be me, to be a person, and also I'm willing to do something and to sacrifice for the greater good of the relationship, and I'm going to go deep. That's going to deepen my relationship, and I think in some ways that's what, the relationship with God can be too, is to say, I don't want to get up and go to Minyan this morning. It's like, is that really what's being asked of me? Like, I'm tired, I want to stay in bed. But you go and you do it, not because you think a lightning bolt is going to come and strike you, but because you know that in that giving up of the extra hour in bed or doing something else with that time, that there's a depth to the relationship with God and with community that can emerge out of that.
I really read that midrash as part of a whole school of rabbinic anxiety, which is not actually about God at all, but it is about a kind of a rabbinic fear that we're not going to do what we should do unless we feel scared of the consequences, or unless we feel, really scolded. Okay. No? That time wasn't me. When I was younger, I really had a very strong reaction to that whole school of, why do they have no confidence in our ability to do the right thing? Why do we have so many rules and regulations and practical threats? Our 12-year-old, when she hears things like this, she'll say, God is such an insecure narcissist that, God always needs us to say, oh, you're so great, you're so amazing, yay, God, what is going on? And I try to, you'll have the pleasure of working with her this year, but I try to explain that it's not for God, it's for us. How does it serve us? And, I have found as I've gotten older, the idea of having, keva, of structure, of siag, of things that kind of protect us, I have found extremely helpful as I've gotten older and kind of needed sometimes the push and needed sometimes the structure. Not because I'm afraid that the mountain's going to fall on my head, although as we go through life, we find that mountains do fall on our heads, and we sometimes need that structure to help us get through it. But I think it goes back to what Felicia was saying at the beginning about how countercultural it is to be in covenant, or to feel obligated, to feel that we are required to do something. And for a lot of us, especially in non-Orthodox contexts, it's much easier to think about an obligation to other people, an obligation to our community, than an obligation to God, because it's so ephemeral. But if I know that I promised Roly and Felicia that I would come tonight, then even though I'm tired, I'm going to come tonight. So I think, thinking about how we feel a sense of responsibility to our community, to show up, to be present, to make these rituals and these holidays and these experiences part of our lives in a kavua way, in a set way, it gives us a structure that I think ultimately can be really helpful. It's not about nobody believes that we can do it, but it's about, here is a scaffolding that can help you in the times in your life where you need something to hold on to.
I think, I agree with you, and I think that this midrash really, another way to look at it is to say, life without Torah, without covenant is not worth it. It's not life. It becomes a grave. You become dead if you're not bound, if you're not bound to purpose, if you're not bound to community, if you're not bound to obligations, if you're not bound to a vision of a better world, like it says here in the destiny. if you're not bound and committed and connected to all those things, might as well die. And look at
Roly,
where the
to
world
take it,
is.
I mean, this is where we are.
This is where we are.
I mean, literally, this is where we are, right?
Yeah.
It's not like we will, this is a situation where the habitability of our planet is threatened because of the unwillingness to recognize this covenant.
Yeah.
Right now. So this is a very alive midrash right now.
I think I would just add also that I think part of it does go back into touching into some of the pieces what everyone is sharing. I personally am thinking a lot about what is it to bring that fear into the spiritual practice that I'm in and into the covenant and into the why am I showing up, and what is it to recognize that the fear can be present in those moments. And that I think a lot about it's something that I think only sparked for me recently this year of going into Bishalach when we're crossing the sea, that fear is a huge part of that moment too, of when we become a nation, that was a very joyous moment, but there's an incredible amount of fear, and that's an external fear. As we're standing at the edge of the ocean, at the edge of the Yam, about to cross, the Egyptians are coming at us. There's this real sense of fear, which again the Torah tells us, and we embody that before we go into the Shirat Hayam, before we sing and we dance and we celebrate our redemption. And our tefillah every single morning brings us to that point twice. It brings us to that point at the end of Psukei de Zimra, and when we go into the Shir, and then also we go back to that moment right before the Amidah. And I've been playing a lot with that in my practice, again, of what is it to say at these moments of covenant, these moments of spiritual connection with each other, with God, that sometimes that external fear of what's happening around us in the world can be brought into it. I don't actually have an answer to it. I'm still very much playing with this, but how is it and why is it that even in our ritual every single day, those moments are the ones that are bringing us to the point of reliving it in a sense and inviting it in and not ignoring it as a way of also saying that in order to face it, maybe that's what it means to live in a world where it's either die or choose this, but that we have to also face the fact that the fear is real and it's palpable and it can be brought into the spiritual practice, or maybe it can be. If anyone else has answers to that, I'd be curious, but it's something I've been holding a lot in my personal prayer practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we can make a good segue from that Soloveitchik text to the next, which is, again, one of those classic midrashim about, well, what exactly happened at Sinai. And I think for me, actually, the bridge, the segue from one to the next has to do with what Soloveitchik says about edut, about witnessing. I know Felicia and Roly, you asked us to bring our favorite text about Brit, and I thought of this in part because I think the Jewish spiritual paradigm, which informs this, is the idea that differentiation and distinction and diversity flows out of oneness. The basic Jewish, premise is that everything is connected. It's all connected. So, in a sense, for me, Brit is really the willingness to recognize a pre-existing relationship, not to create the relationship. The relationship exists, and denying the relationship, that's why that midrash to me means, God is basically saying, look, when we're in a relationship, you're in a relationship with me, with all of creation. If you don't recognize it, it won't survive. And that's our current predicament right now. So the fear goes into that, and the vision goes into that. But it is a pre-existent reality, and that's a little bit of a distinction also, I think, between the American paradigm and the Jewish paradigm. Because in the American paradigm, we have this idea, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Our paradigm is the opposite, e unum pluribus, out of one, many. The differentiation emerges out of that. So that's why this particular midrash is really powerful for me as a model of how to understand Brit, not as, oh, let's create a community out of differentiation. Let's create a relationship. No, we're in relationship. We're going to recognize relationship. We're going to recognize what flows out of the relationship. So I don't know. How should we do this? You want to just again read a little? Okay. So this is from Midrash Tanchuma, Shemot on Shemot. Go and see how God's voice went out to all Israelites. According to each one, according to their koach, according to their strength, their capacity. So we have the zakenim, the elders, the adults, the youths, the little ones, even the infants. Each heard the voice of God according to their koach, to their capacity. It's really just amazing. I think it's such a beautiful idea. Of course, there has to be a proof text here to lay this on. Even Moses heard it according to his particular capacity. Moses spoke, and God responded the kol. In a voice, in a sound, in a communication that Moses was able to bear, that was within his capacity, his frequency. You could hear it on his frequency. V'chein hu omer, kol Adonai ba'koach, from Psalm 29. The voice of God is in koach, is in strength. B'kocho lo ne'amar ela ba'koach. B'kocho lo ne'amar ela ba'koach. It doesn't say in his or her power or capacity, but stam, simply koach, strength. And that's on that basis we can discern that everyone heard the voice of God according to a capacity that they were able to bear. Even the women, of course. By the way, sorry, even the women, yeah, right. And that's why it says, Kol echad v'echad lefi kocho. Okay, someone want to take the second part? Just keep going, I'll keep going.
I'll read.
You want
to? Rabbi Yossi, the son of Hanina, stated, if you are amazed at this, remember that the manna descended for each Israelite with a taste that varied according to the needs of each individual. The young man, for instance, ate it as bread, as it is said, behold, I will cause to rain bread from heaven for you. The elders ate it as wafers of honey, as it is said, and the taste of it was like wafers made from honey. The sucklings as milk from the breasts of their mothers, as it says, and the taste of it was the taste of a cake baked with oil. For the ill, as fine flour mixed with honey, as it is said, you didst eat fine flour and honey and oil. And the Gentiles who tasted it found it as bitter as coriander seed. As it is said, now the manna was like coriander seed.
Okay.
No, I was just going to comment. I think that going back to the kind of the tension around, I think part of what's challenging in our time of the idea of covenant is the notion of personal autonomy or authority. And in many ways, that's the kind of modern challenge of what it means to be bound. And that's where a lot of the opposition to the notion of covenanting comes from, is that I don't want to give up my own personal authority. And I think this is a really different way to think about what it means to be a person and covenanted, which is that my role in the covenant is unique and particular, but it doesn't keep me unbounded. And I think that's a really powerful, and Shuli and I were talking about this the other day, that because we talk about covenant all the time in our meetings, is Rabbi Dr. Eugene Borowitz, alav shalom, wrote a book called Renewing the Covenant, and the basic challenge I think that he was wrestling with the notion was personal autonomy and covenanting, because he didn't want to give up either. And I think this is one of the texts for me that really raises up the power of what it means to have a collective and and in many ways our own personal authority in relationship to the covenant is what we can bear. You know, that actually what makes my role in the covenant particular and unique is not only because I'm a particular and unique person, but actually that's part of the multiplicity of what the oneness is about. My uniqueness is what makes me covenanted in many ways, whereas often we think of what covenant is what we share. And I think that's a really also interesting, powerful challenge and inspiring, really, to think about. And I think as we've been developing the notion of the community covenant, is really like that's part of the power of what it means to live in community, is not only coming together for what we share, which we share a lot, but we don't share everything. Yet part of what makes community powerful is the uniqueness that someone brings to the table that makes them particularly commanded to bring that forth. And that kind of tension, inspiration, commitment is part of what I love about this text. And that's Sinai, you know, like, is to actually be able to be attentive and discern that uniqueness.
I agree, and there's a word here in the translation. It says here, look at the first line, observe that God's voice went forth to each Israelite in accordance with the individual's capacity to receive it. And that's not in the Hebrew. It's not about receiving it. It says that each person heard the voice, lefi kocho, according to their own power, which can also mean, it can mean that they received it, each person according to their capacity to absorb. But it also means, or also could mean, that each person heard lefi kocho, according to their own power, to give, to participate, to do. In other words, look at a community like ours. We are, I don't know how many, thousands of individuals, from little children to older adults, and everybody has a different capacity, different skills, different interests, different proclivities. Everybody has power to do something in this community, from very little things to very big things, to give money. We give money. We ask people to give money. Some people can give $18, some people can give $18,000 or more. Everybody lefi kocho. Everybody has to stand and actualize their power and their potential in this covenant. I think this is one reading here, to say God called everybody to do what is in their power to do for the sake of the relationship, for the sake of the covenant with God and with each other. So it's not just, for many years I understood this midrash as everybody heard it according to their, incorporated according to what they could hear. But now I'm expanding out of this gathering and this reading my understanding of this midrash.
It reminds me of my favorite High Holiday story, which I've told a zillion times at family services, about the prince that runs away from home, but then he misses his parents, and his friends say, go back, and he says, I can't, I've come too far, and I don't have the strength anymore. And at that moment, the message arrives from his father, the king, saying, come back as far as your strength will take you, and wherever that place is, I will meet you there. And what's so beautiful about that, and what I hold in that, is that we are asked to go as far as our strength will take us. And at the same time, to know that wherever that place is, that we will be met. But the challenge remains, like, you have to go, what is as far as your strength will take you, for you personally, in relation to covenant, in relationship to community, in relationship to God.
This is also a very different spin on it that I hadn't thought about until looking at it. Also seeing both pieces of the midrash. I think I've always thought of it just as the first piece. I don't know if anyone else has also seen it isolated, but when you bring in the piece about the man and thinking about flipping it then of the subject not being about us, Roly, as you're also saying, kind of changing that image of us receiving, but it's what is it, our strength, or what is our calling in it. That also thinking about what is the role of the covenant itself, or the Torah, that there's this beautiful idea here that the Torah tastes like what it is you need it to taste like in that moment. That when you bring the metaphor of the man and what it is that each of us can also have our own relationship with Torah, even though it itself is one entity. It's the man, it is the Torah, but each time we approach it, and each time we approach it maybe at a different point in our lives and at a different moment, it can give us a different kind of strength. It can speak to us in a way, if we're open to it, it may taste different each time we're approaching it. And there's a sweetness to that, and there can also potentially even be a bitterness to that, which is part of being in a deep relationship with something.
Well, I think it's such an important aspect of thinking about what does it mean to be part of an Eidah, that you can, I think, read in the Soloveitchik text that there's a sameness that's required to be in an Eidah with people, right? A uniformity or a conformity. And that if somebody else is not doing it the way that I'm doing it, they're doing it wrong, or they're doing it less. And this is a radical counterpoint to that, to say that it's amazing if it tastes different to everybody, and that it's a good thing that everybody's going to experience it according to where they are. And it's, of course, I think this midrash is such a powerful counterpoint to what I think is one of the saddest psukim in the Torah, which I think you're going to be studying later tonight in somebody's teaching, which is when Bnei Israel say to Moshe, we can't deal with this. It's too much. It's too intense. We don't want to hear God's voice directly. You have to do it for us. Which I feel like we're all constantly clawing our way back from to try to get back closer to God. And this is a way in to say that we can find a way. We can be met where we are. It can taste the way we need it to taste, the way that it will nourish us. And it's just so radically different from a sense that to belong to community, you have to conform and you have to do it a certain way and fulfill all of the things, or else you don't belong.
I just don't want to ignore the complicated aspect where it speaks about the Gentiles and having a bitter taste. I think sometimes we just pass over, and the women too, but in this particular case, I think in many ways it feels, this may be a Roly, but the positive interpretation of this, which is I think one of the things that the voice of the tradition does often is it contemplates how to hold the people on the periphery. And in this case, it's not that the Gentiles are not actually contemplated. They actually are brought in to taste. And obviously there are many midrashim that ask different communities, do you want the Torah? And they say no for all these different reasons. And in many ways, I think it goes to Ayelet's point, which is, how do we think about who's in our midst? And there's always someone who's outside the bound. In this case, women are in one zone, and Gentiles are often considered outside, and yet there is this idea, I think, that it's painful to read it, to know that it doesn't taste the same. But the recognition also is that because you're not covenanted, which doesn't mean that also it's not possible. But I think that is a wrestling, I think, that we do, is how far does the bound go? Does the boundary go? And do we have to put red lines? And where do they go? And I think that's one of the big questions in our time is does everyone get to taste? And if they feel that sense of sweetness, Do they get to belong just because they feel the sweetness? And different communities are defining those boundaries differently, which is part of why I think the question of Edah is really powerful at this moment and challenging, is because I think the boundaries are being pushed in really hard and tough ways. And so I just want to acknowledge that the tradition doesn't make those questions go away. But what that does also is it exposes different populations. In this case, Gentiles. Often women are put in those positions. Like the more marginalized people are then the litmus tests for how do you account for in and out. And I think one of the things that we really, since the JIBC process, the Jewish belonging and community process, around where we made the decision around officiation, around multi-heritage marriages, is really recognizing like there's not an all in and all out. There's a lot of different ways, and belonging actually moves in lots of different ways. And so I think that's also a powerful part of this text, is it raises the question, do you taste? Do you have koach? And it puts that to us as spiritual beings, as Jews, to actually ask the question, do I actually have it? Or can I get it? Which is, or can I come to it in a certain way, which is, I think, really powerful.
I was just going to add that I think about all the ways we taste the manna as nourishment, right? We're nourished in many, many ways by Torah, by learning. And I actually think that showing the people on the outside, in this case, the Gentiles, as the text is talking about, is actually asking us, those of us who are nourished, how is it that how can we share that nourishment with those for whom it's bitter? I think it's actually, I'm not sure if it was intended that way, but I think to read it with our eyes is to really feel a certain sense of obligation that something that's so nourishing to us, how can we make sure that it tastes has some sweetness to those who feel outside and not nourished by it?
Beautiful, beautiful. Just wanted to say a counterpoint to this midrash about women and Gentiles, Book of Ruth, central to Shavuot. Central. Women and a Gentile woman who come to Torah and who teach the rest of the community really something really important about what Chesed is about, which the community sometimes doesn't have. But the outsider comes, or those on the margin come to teach about the value of Chesed.
I was, first of all, Felicia, I really appreciate that you brought it up, because I do sometimes have a tendency to kind of let's look at the happy parts. And I just want to go back to the Soloveitchik of fear versus aspiration. I think that when the Gentiles and when women get marginalized, that these are moments of fear and that they deform Torah. I hate to say it, but it comes from fear. Those other people that we're afraid of, well, they can't taste it right. And even with women, I think there's a lot of fear. And it's funny, Ayelet, you were saying that the pasuk that you think that you feel is so sad. I thought you were going to say, "Don't go near a woman," right? It's like here we are talking. There's a lot of sad ones. I know it's so hard to choose. So how do we relate to those texts that come out of fear and that are hard for us to look at? I don't have anything more to say about that.
I wanted to just lift up, because I think that earlier conversation about Soloveitchik beautifully didn't resolve, but it helped us, I think, distill the paradox of fear and aspiration. And here, too, there's a paradox, right, of multiplicity and oneness. And as human beings, it's very difficult for us to hold that, right, to understand that. We can't wrap our heads around it. We can't understand it rationally, because it seems like it's just contradictory. God spoke, but everybody heard something different, right? One kind of food, but everybody tasted something different, right? So there's something here about people at the same time being able to actually have the experiencing something differently, and knowing that it was all the same experience. That is amazing. And that is rare, and that is so needed today, because it seems like a dichotomy. It's one way or the other, right? It's In America, it's like rugged individualism, everyone for themselves, right? And a fear of some imaginary monolithic imposition of authority. That's the boogeyman that's thrown out there, right? And then there's a real threat. The same, left and right both fear the same thing. So to have a model that says it is possible to have absolute commitments to diversity, right? And to have a common purpose, to have yirah and ahava at the same time, mingled together as one. It's really, I think, it's amazing.
There's also another paradox in the Midrash, which is what your koach is and what your suffering is. Mm-hmm. It uses both the notion that we receive Torah according to our koach, and also we see what we can tolerate, basically. And I think that too is another one of the paradoxes that we can't wrap our heads around, which is, I think, really powerful.
Yeah, just to I'll just say this one more piece, which is that to take that one step further, at the end of the Midrash, there's this phrase here about that they heard it according to their koach, kadei shelo yinasku, so that they shouldn't be hurt. Nobody should be hurt in the process. Everyone should be safe in this process, which is just one more piece I think that's worth lifting up as part of this. Second line in the third section there, at the end of the second line. Right.
I picked a very different text. When I was asked to pick a text I loved about covenant, I want to give a little bit of introduction because many people may have not seen this text before. So I went to a book that I was first introduced to when it came out in 1998. I was a rabbinical student at the time, and I was in a feminist reading group with one of our professors, and I had this is the later version, the paperback, but of the first edition, and it just really, how could I put it? It just brought up so many things for me as a young woman rabbinical student at the time. I also happened to study a lot about the tractate Kiddushin, about marriage in rabbinical school. It was one of the tractates that we studied for a whole year. I also ended rabbinical school by getting married, so it was very thematic in my life. But I really think it's important. Look, the metaphor we have about the Jewish people and God is a metaphor of marriage. And this text is about not the metaphor, but the real thing. And just to give you a little bit of context, Professor Rachel Adler, came out with this book in 1998, like I said. It's filled with lots of rich material. It could be like a study book for a year of study or something. But the two things that really stuck with me, the second being the Brit Ahuvim that I'm going to talk about tonight, but the first, it's related, and I think it's related to our conversation. The first thing that really stuck with me from this book is that she talks about how many prayers have been translated into English in our day and age, and have been changed dramatically from what they say in the Hebrew to make us feel better as modern people, and to be more in line with our values and how we think about women and how we think about the matriarchs and how we think about God. And she makes this very strong point that I feel like BJ really lives, actually, is that you can't just change it in the English, because then it basically is saying to people that if you really are invested in Jewish life enough to know the Hebrew and to pray in the Hebrew, it won't matter to you that it's problematic in the Hebrew. It's only if you want to read the English and feel good about it that it needs to be translated. And I think that's very powerful, and I think what I want to sort of focus on in the covenant that she talks about here is that she really wanted the marriage ceremony, and she's very attached to the tradition, but she really wanted the marriage ceremony to be in line with the values of how we see marriage at this point in the late 20th century and now the 21st century. And so she took the time to really analyze the tradition, to analyze the fact that she felt like there was a disconnect between the language in the ketubah and the whole marriage ceremony that has existed for thousands of years, and what we really understand as a covenantal relationship today. And she felt like you can't, and she said basically that there's a lot of language. The Sheva Brachot at a traditional Jewish wedding are beautiful and filled with lots of wonderful phrases about hope and the future and joining together, and it feels very covenantal in that part. But she pointed out that the whole earlier part of the marriage ceremony stemmed from a tradition that we've had long, Talmudic tradition of a man acquiring a wife. And there's a whole, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but there's a whole there's a whole tractate full of discussions of this, and there's lots of biblical verses that are brought in, and part of it, there's the language of kedusha, which is a very important word to us, kiddush, and but Kaddish, right? We have this sort of setting apart and sanctification, but in the case of the traditional marriage ceremony, it really is about this acquisition and a man setting aside a woman, and probably many of you know that part of the issue of this, of course, has to do with if the marriage doesn't last, the man has to give the get, right? It's not a dual kind of relationship. And so she felt it was really important that this, what she felt was a brit, which I think many of us think of our marriages or the marriages people in our lives as a covenantal type relationship, that was represented in the ceremony and in the text that is signed at a Jewish wedding. So I'll just point out a few. And one other thing I would just say, as we've sort of brought up over the evening, different midrashim and different messages, she also wasn't inventing this from scratch. As you'll see in a moment, she used a lot of biblical verses in support of this idea. But she also found historically that it wasn't always so. One of the interesting things she talks about is that some of the earlier ketubot from the Palestinian tradition actually talked about the language of partnership, shutafot, which had sort of been a lost tradition when this whole notion of sort of acquisition took over. And so that was one of the things she talked about. That's my, you can leave that one down. Okay. I wanted to read one quote. And I think actually this connects a little bit to Rabbi and what you were saying about what do we do with these parts of the tradition that are hard for us, right? And I think one of the things that I love about her writing is that she says you have to take it on. You have to go. She talks about being in the thickets and really dealing with the text and facing it and figuring out a way to work with it to get it to a different place. So she talks about that both in terms of prayer, but she also talks about it here. So she says, again, for Judaism's future to be rescued, something will have to die. We must consent to be bereaved in order to be renewed. Again, we must try to balance respect for rituals, time-honored performative language with the ethical demand that we use that language with intention and integrity. So I think it's an important idea as we're thinking about covenant and thinking about covenant in 2020, 2022. What does that mean? What are we hanging on to from the tradition that's really important to our idea of covenant, and what is it that we have to struggle with to have a covenant that really is authentic to our aspirations today, to what it means to be part of the Eidah today. So if you look at your text on page 3, it starts on page 3 in the Hebrew. We'll just focus on the English. But she basically, this is instead of a ketubah. We could have looked at them side by side, but I didn't think we'd have a lot of time. But if you look at then on top of page 4, she starts talking about what covenant is about, different elements of covenant in a marriage. So first she says it's a covenant of protection and hope. I was thinking about the protection and the whole idea of fear, right? Does covenant give you a sense of safety? Protection and hope, like the covenant that God swore to Noah and his descendants, right? About showing the rainbow and saying that God will no longer destroy the earth. So covenant is about protection and hope. Then covenant is about distinction, segula, which was actually in a lot of the piyutim that we were chanting earlier, right? It's this notion of this treasured relationship, something we really value, right? I think this was a little bit of what Ayelet, you were talking about, of like being with like-minded people and feeling that sense of real deep connection and value and treasure. And that is compared to the idea that's quoted in Jeremiah about God claiming us to be God's people and being our God. And then devotion. And by the way, this at the time that this was written, it wasn't really initially about same-sex marriage, but it opened the door for same-sex marriage in a very powerful way. I meant to say this at the beginning. When I studied this, and even when I got married, it was really a conceptual framework. And today, in 2022, you can go online and get your ketubah to be this, which is amazing. I didn't even know that. I hadn't looked at ketubot in a long time. But it's become a standard ketubah that's used and has been accepted by the conservative movement. The reform movement had ketubot that were different already at this time, but she really kind of brought this to light for many more people. So there's a covenant of distinction, the covenant of devotion, and it talks about the relationship between David and Jonathan, this love relationship, this closeness, right? So this covenant is about God and all of humanity. In the case of Noah, there's a covenant of distinction between God and the Jewish people, a covenant of devotion between two people, which of course is very much what's happening at a wedding. And then finally, a covenant of mutual loving kindness. And then it refers to the covenant between God and Zion. So taking all of these verses and lifting them up and saying, this is the kind of relationship we want this couple to have, a mutual relationship, a relationship of respect. And then it goes on, and we won't read all of it because I want everyone to keep going and to add their comments, but it actually then spells out the provisions of what that looks like, right, in very specific terms. So it's about everyday companionship and doing the most precious things in life together, like studying Torah, as well as sleeping next to the person and telling your deepest secrets, having an intimate relationship. Then it's about saying this is special and separate and it's just the two of us in this relationship. And then all of the responsibilities that this was referred to earlier, right? With marriage, you don't know what's coming. It tries to lay it out for you here in this Brit Ahuvim. Guess what? When you have kids and a family, that's going to be your responsibilities. I don't think it goes into this, but having parents are responsibilities that you share. And then at the very end, it talks about the end of life and being a partner to, we have the English kind of till death do we part, but she really spells out what that means, to really be in deep relationship with someone through all the days of your life. So I wanted to share that, whatever it can add to this conversation, but I think to me it's really about the seriousness of language and having the language, as you're writing a covenant, really reflect your deepest values, taking from the tradition what is true and enduring, and also interpreting what needs to be reinterpreted.
I would just say that one of the things I love about her is that she is willing to be in the thicket, and she holds the tradition for raising something up rather than saying goodbye. And the power of this text is to recognize that even though there are complicated structures by which the traditional marriage ceremony exists, there are alternative models that are also birthed in the tradition. And I think one of the things that's challenging is that some of our most beautiful and powerful structures also contain really deep and problematic underbellies. And so the power of covenant, which is originated in many ways if you take the coercive version, right? Like why in some way the stories are so powerful is because they don't set up one model and one of the things that I think is so powerful about our tradition is it has the counter voice as much as it has the standard voice. And she is able, and I think one of the things that she challenges us to do is not rehearse the problem. One of the things that Rachel Adler, I think, challenges us about the liturgy is that we're not rehearsing problematic ethics. And I think that's the challenge of being in a community that cares deeply about the tradition and is reverential towards the tradition, while also recognizing it has deeply challenging and problematic aspects. And I think we're always trying to figure out how do we hold both, because a lot of communities are either weighing one way or the other. And she, I think, does an incredible job of holding both. And I think we sometimes lift in one ways or the others, and on a night like Sinai, like we're trying to live today, we don't want to be inauthentic for who we are. And I think that's what she tries to bring out at the wedding is if you're standing around a chuppah, you don't want to be saying something that's not authentic to who you are, which is the hope also today and tonight that we'll stand for who we are, our own koach, and not suppress who we are when we're supposed to be standing at the most incredible moment of our lives.
I have to admit, I have a real allergy to the wedding metaphors of Shavuot. I think, obviously there are a lot of ways to reframe them. I think traditionally it's so heteronormative. It's so about a kind of compulsory expectation of marriage that if you think about a paradigm of marriage as an all-powerful male God and a submissive female Israel, it's so disturbing on so many levels to me, and that if you're not partnered, you're outside of a relationship with God. I have a lot of issues with it. And I think that Rachel Adler does an amazing job of tikkun, of trying to create a corrective to a lot of these paradigms, which I think are so powerful in Jewish life and Jewish tradition, even today. And, all kinds of progressive shuls have the boys and the girls dress up as brides on Shavuot to receive the Torah. And I don't know what really is going on there. And why that's still such a fantasy and so appealing, because it's such a limited view, I think, of both the covenantal relationship with God, the covenantal relationship with Torah, the idea of what's available in terms of fulfillment and finding love in relationships and community. And so what I love about what Rachel Adler does here is she brings all of these different paradigms of covenant. It's not just one way. And that even if, obviously she's doing this so that it can be used for a marriage, but that even in that we should draw from different traditions. So it's the opposite. Instead of saying that everything good is just like a wedding, to say that a wedding can be a lot of different good things, a lot of different kinds of covenants, and that there is value in our lives, in our relationships with the divine, in our relationships with Torah, in finding strength and inspiration from many different kinds of covenantal relationships. Some of those are romantic love, some of those are not. Some of those are heteronormative, some of them are not. And that we can find that inspiration and that connection with God in many, many different places.
I think what you just said, sorry, go ahead.
I love what you just said, Ayelet, that you can think of a marriage as that covenant as drawing from different types of covenants, and that's beautifully explicit here. But one thing that is missing for me is the example of a covenant of obligation. Even though she does use that word later on, the first covenant that she brings is actually a covenant where there's no obligation on the part of humanity. This is where God says, I'm never going to destroy the earth again, no matter what. It's not like, well, you have to do something in order for me not to destroy the earth. It's in some ways one might say, is that a covenant or is that a promise? Like how do we understand what's really going on there? And I think that, I'm glad she, has brought it in later on, but that is one of the things that I do, for all of its problematics, that I do find, meaningful about the traditional ketubah, is that it actually spells out the specific obligations that, in that context, a husband has to a wife, because women were more marginalized in that society and didn't have economic stability, and so these are the things that a husband must provide for a wife, and it really spells them out, like food and clothing, and if I die, it's this much money. We can, again, talk about all the problematics with that, but it is a framework of obligation, and that, to me, feels very significant, not just in thinking about marriage, but in thinking about what is covenant overall. There has to be that language and that framework of obligation. I think, Marc, what you were saying earlier about where we are in this country, that America is a rights-based society. Judaism is an obligation-based tradition. And there's something that how did we get here to this country? We have not, our narrative is not one of mutual obligation. We show up to be there for each other for the sake of creating something better. We do what we want, and no one can take away my rights. As a modern Jew, how do I hold both of those things? I lean a little heavier on the obligation side, coming from my the Jewish perspective, and I, of course, understand the right side and believe in that as well. But I think we could do more to think about what is the role of obligation in all of these relationships, but particularly for society.
I'm thinking how that it gets reflected in community, in the covenant of community, where largely, not only joining is voluntary, but also the participation. Once you've joined, participation is voluntary. How much you participate, how much you do, how much you show up, you come to me and do Bikor Cholim, you participate in the shelter, you give money. It's all voluntary. There's no sense, once you're in, there's no sense of obligation. How do you generate a sense of obligation? Now I want to just shift for a moment to this notion, this old notion, you have to belong to Jewish community because you need a place for the high holidays, you need a place for the kids to go to Hebrew school, for a bar mitzvah, all this sense of, you do it because of some sort of a ulterior motive. And we're trying for a community, I think, to get the sense that we're here to protect each other, to hope together, to have some sense of a connection, that we are for each other, that we are responsible for each other, that we're devoted to each other. All these principles that are here, that there's loving kindness in this relationship of ours as a community, how to introduce some of these elements into the covenant of community, not just because you have to belong, you have to pay your dues, you have to, all of this old model of community, Jews have to stick together, belong to a different time. So how to infuse our own covenant of our own community with some of these elements, I think is a beautiful challenge for us.
I just want to say something very quickly in response to what you said about how do you cultivate that sense of obligation, not that everything is voluntary. I was remarking to someone this morning, if you've been here or you've seen on the live stream, at the end of services there are, at the end of tefillot, there are some trays with cups of grape juice. And there's no sign up to volunteer to be a grape juice distributor. People just get up and take the trays and pass them around. And I said to someone, I don't want to have a sign up for this ever. I don't want this to be a thing that people have to volunteer to do. That just the culture, the thing that you do here is that you see that the tray hasn't been passed out, and so you get up and you do it. And that is it was such a perfect example of that. And when we see people doing that, people standing up and saying, oh, this has to get done, that I think is part of what creates that culture where people say, oh, this is what it means to be part of this community. It means I get up and I do something sometimes.
I want to, Roly made this comparison between Yom HaAtzmaut and Tisha B'Av, and I want to make another comparison that's related to this question between Shavuot and Yom Kippur. So you were talking about there are more people come on Tisha B'Av than Yom HaAtzmaut. What's the one time when BJ is packed to the rafters? Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is much more of a kind of an individualistic, like it's your moment of your own personal transformation. Now, obviously, it's everybody being together as part of the power, but Shavuot is really sort of the communal moment of covenanting, of transformation. And I think that I'm very happy that all these people are here this evening. But I think that one of the reasons that Shavuot is more sparsely attended is that it is harder for us to think about communal covenanting than about personal, even if it is an obligation, Shuli, that thinking of it as like my obligation rather than our obligation as a community, I think is a very challenging concept for us. And I look forward to hearing what's going to happen with this communal covenant, because it is very countercultural to say we are going to covenant. What does it look like for us to covenant ourselves, you know?
It's exactly the opposite. Kol nidrei is how you undo yourself of all the commitments that you've taken that you haven't fulfilled. Right. So you take the commitments here, and then Yom Kippur come, you can free yourself from the. That's why we all come.
I just want to say that I think your point is well taken, Shuli, about the obligations. In many ways, I feel like what her text does is it regrounds the essence of the why for obligation, because I think that's the challenge of living in a patriarchal tradition, or a tradition born in certain places where certain versions of what true life lived, whether that was marriage or, you know, all the frameworks that existed may have had a certain obligation to them, but they're also deeply coercive. And so I think that's the exposure of kind of re-anchoring Brit in something other than the coercive structure that obligation was born in. And the same, I think, of Ayelet's point about the God-people metaphor, which is, I think, also what Judith Plaskow tried to do in Standing Again at Sinai, is to strip the problematic and name the unnamed things in order to reground us in what we want the most. And I think that is what we're hoping for the community covenant, is that we're transparent about the destiny that we want to have as a community and try to put that center stage, recognizing, of course, all the ways we have to function as a machaneh, also as the, and so I think that's our hope and our vision for building this community covenant, is really that we can kind of hold all these texts together in many ways, the deeply protective aspect of why we have a history that we do, and also the aspirational for that, and that each of us also has a role to play in our own uniqueness, and then also that we don't want to live out old pains that continually punish people because of their place in society, or because, I mean, we're a community, I think I'm the only single person up here, but we're a community of many single people, and the norms that Jewish communities have functions which place certain people on the in and certain people on the out. We have the flag, you know, the rainbow colors up for Pride Month, that if we're going to honor the story about Lefi Kocho, that each a person according to their strength, we have to be willing to dismantle some assumptions, many assumptions and norms that regulate our society without unbinding us to commitment. And I think that's really the hope of what this process for our community is about, and looking at these texts is really to be able to, I mean, it's kind of funny how these texts came together as a whole, as they tell a really powerful story about lots of different voices about what covenanting is about. And I want to say also how wonderful it is. We never get to be in conversation like this all together, to be with beloved friends and colleagues and a great team that we have in the community, to be in conversation. And we look forward to many more opportunities to be in dialogue, and we have all night to do that.
So thank you to Ayelet and Marc and Shuli and Rachel and Becca and Felicia and I, together with Aaron and Grace, are going to now move up. Hopefully many of you will want to stay, for at least for part of the night, if not for the entire night. It's a covenant, and you can't escape. We're going to hold the mountain above your head.
Yeah, I was going to say, you must eat cheesecake. You must eat cheesecake.
So we're going to go up to the roof on the 6th floor, and we're going to start in about 10 minutes. We have time. I think there's some food. Please take take the text with you. I think there's some food upstairs. And if you are comfortable outside, you can put your masks, can take off your masks if you're comfortable. If you're not comfortable, by all means, you can wear them. And we're going to spend a few hours of learning. You can take for any or all of it. Hag Sameach.